We are, as you know, doing. We started our little pilot TV series, which was Clone Wars, and we are now going to move that into a 3D animation half-hour version, which will be a regular series. I'm going to get it started and hire the showrunners and all that sort of thing, but then I'm going to step away from it and go and do other things.
When George announced that the show was going to be happening, I think it was, 2005 back in Indianapolis, Celebration 3. And he said that he was going to kick off the show, get you on your feet, and then he was going to step back. Is George still as hands-on as he's ever been?
He was very hands-on in the beginning. I would see him more than once a week at times. I would have them done and direct them to a certain point until I thought they were ready. And then I would show them to him and say, what do you think of this? But once we established the look of the show, he did step back to a degree. But, you know, he will always be involved in the, he sees a story reel, which is like a very rough form of an episode. So he watches that, and then he gives me notes. He used to come in for those, and we would sit together and watch them. Now he just calls me.
And there have been times when we wanted to use things from the EU, and I was like, yeah, but we can't use it that way, so why? I don't want to use it and change it. You know, I don't want to use it and make it something completely different. That's rude.
Dave had us, you know, try to combine a lot of different things.
When I sat down with Dave in the story launch, he made sure to tell me that he wanted the space battle to be huge, epic, and bigger than anything we'd ever done before.
I said, Kyle, we really need to have a good space battle here. This is the defense of a major military operation for the Republic. It has to be a huge scale. And the poor guy, he showed me these early shots of, you know, the battle he was thinking. And I remember saying to him, I said, Kyle, you do plan on having spaceships in my spaceship battle, don't you?
He was like, yeah, but even more lasers, more explosions.
It became very clear that the fans also really related to the rookies. They really liked that episode, and we thought, wow, we've really got something here. George took special notice of that, and after several discussions, he wanted to go back and see who these guys were before they got to the Rishi Moon. I took something I liked, wolves, and I said, I'm putting that on a clone trooper helmet. When we got to season 3, you know, I discussed it with Killian Plunkett. Well, it's probably time to start a change. We've seen the classic episode 2 clones for 2 seasons, 3 seasons really, once you're done with season 3. And it's time to start introducing the idea that they're going to change their helmets at some point, like they have in Revenge of the Sith. So when we did the ARC Troopers, I'd come up with the idea that the ARC Troopers are wearing experimental armor on Kamino, and the ARCs are being trained there in quite a lot amount of secrecy, like you hear in the EU. Things that we got to do was go to Alderaan. Now this is pretty amazing. I mean, I know we saw it in Revenge of the Sith, and that was very eye-opening because they had these alpine mountains, and it was this kind of futuristic castle set up there in these mountains. And growing up, I had always thought of Alderaan as more of the grasslands that Ralph McQuarrie, I think, had famously painted in early development for the original Star Wars. But, you know, when working with George, he wants to see Bail go to those mountainous regions, the castle where we saw him in Revenge of the Sith. So let's dig up all the old concept artwork that George had done for Revenge of the Sith and see how that stuff works still. Let's look at all of Ralph's old data on Alderaan. So we're taking something Alderaan, which in the original Star Wars was just a matte painting of a planet that got blown up. And now we're going to go there, and that's always exciting, but now we want to make sure we get it right. We've got to make sure that we connect with all the different Lucas divisions that have ever done anything with Alderaan, and see how, you know, for this series, for George specifically, we can make it look like he wants it to. It's undeniable that Anthony Daniels solidifies this show as Star Wars. It starts to round out this idea that there is a much bigger, broader world going on in Star Wars than just what you knew or what you thought you knew. It is true, I did make the production stop. I did make them remodel that cake, and I did demand a higher quality cake for Padme's banquet. Maybe that seems nuts to the viewers too, but what it should tell you is that there is no detail too small that we will not try to make better.
At the end of the day, you were swapping something that looked like a cake for something else that looks like a cake.
It was always among the things the fans would ask me is, Dave, when are we going to see Quinlan Vos? For people not in the know, Quinlan Vos was a rather large figure when it came to the comic books of Star Wars and the EU. George liked the character too. You know, he wanted to bring it to the Clone Wars and thought, well, this would be a good episode, Hunting the Hutts. You know, it makes sense to bring Quinlan into it. He's always working with the underworld in the comic books. So we had decisions about the voice, and, you know, of course, we wanted to keep him a gruff, kind of tough guy, older feeling than Anakin, but kind of with less mannerisms.
Because he's been around for so long, there's different interpretations and even different iterations of the character. The first time he appeared, he was wearing a fairly traditional Jedi outfit, very similar to Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan's. And then he went through a sort of dark, you know, angsty, tortured period where he's wearing lots of black leather and eyeliner and stuff. And that seemed a little too far in the other direction. So we sort of looked at the different options there were for a look for Quinlan Vos and tried to settle on one that was pretty iconic and still was credibly a Jedi outfit but didn't look like Obi-Wan's at all. It was a very different palette. There was a lot more sort of tooled leather and decals and stuff.
I started working on this show when I was 17 and I just left for college. And my dad just said, you know, you like to write. Here's a story. Why don't you try to do this? And that ended up being Jedi Crash. And I worked independently on a bunch of episodes, and it was my first experience in season 3 being in an actual writer's room.
When it got time to the writers' meeting, George wanted to do this arc that involved Ventress and the Nightsisters, which we were all pretty excited about.
Season 3 was very much about learning and observing and seeing what it's like to work with people who have ideas and fight for them. We all just pitched ideas and storylines, and it's fun. Season 3 is a lot darker than the rest has been. It's going to be heavy stuff.
We knew we wanted to tell a bit of the story about Ventress in flashback.
It was a great experience to explore Ventress's backstory a little bit more because we never really got a sense of where she came from.
Ventress was now officially a Nightsister herself, which gives you an instant history that hadn't been there in the past, and sort of meant that the way she looked made sense.
I told Dave, I said, boy, it'd be great if when Mother Talzin's talking, it's like these are like spells coming out of her mouth.
Dathomir is a really female-oriented planet. I mean, they rule this whole planet. I was actually really inspired by the book Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which I read in high school, and it's about this kind of utopia of women. The men who are the same species as Darth Maul are kind of like their slaves.
With Darth Maul, he has pretty expensive looking leather boots and gloves, and he's got satin trim on his collar and stuff. But when you look at the average Night Brother, they're wearing pretty much down and dirty outfits that don't have a great deal of finesse to them.
A lot of the fans kind of assume that the Nightsisters can tap into the Force, but as far as I was concerned, they had powers of their own, special powers that their sisterhood used. Whether or not it has anything to do with the Force, maybe that's a matter of opinion.
George wanted to develop this idea of Ventress and who she really is, and expand her story so we really see things from the villainous side, from the dark side, and this brings in the Nightsisters. Now, the Nightsisters themselves are not a new concept. They have been around in Star Wars lore in different novels and different comic books, but like everything, when we sat down to do them with George, you know, this is how the real deal goes for him in his universe. What we have are a clan of witches that live on the planet Dathomir. And George wanted Ventress to have been from these witches, but she had gotten lost at one point. They had to strike a deal and they gave her away. I give a lot of credit to Katie Lucas. She took on this task of writing this trilogy of episodes, and I said, you know, Katie, this is going to be a near and dear thing to a lot of fans, and there are histories about Ventress, and you know, we should give this a once-over. You should look at it and see what you can incorporate. And, you know, I thought Katie did a brilliant job bringing a lot of the history of Ventress, Kyneric, the Ratataki, and how that all went down to her story of Ventress. The fans loved Darth Maul. Loved him. You know, George brought up at the story meeting with the writers that he wanted to bring this character back. Now, we were like, well, that's going to be difficult because you cut him in half. So it's pretty hard to come back from. What we decided instead was, well, there's got to be others of these guys. This is the village where, evidently, according to George Lucas, Darth Maul would have been from. What it all comes down to is what's in that crystal ball at the end of it.
Darth Maul alive? It can't be. I killed him myself.
Strange and disturbing these questions are. How could that be? He got cut in half.
That was news for all of us too. I kind of like that you don't necessarily get a completely clear view of this character, and it's really left open-ended.
I had an opportunity to do something I've wanted to do for a very long time, and that was bring Republic Commandos into the Clone Wars TV series. Now, I'd played the game Republic Commandos, when it came out. I really loved that game, and I've said before that the cinematics from that game really kind of influenced me as to what I thought the Clone Wars could be. It had such a great, look at the world from the trooper's point of view. It occurred to me this would be really good if it was these commandos that were bringing back the bodies of these Jedi. So I felt very strongly that the fans deserved it. I wanted to put the commandos in for a while, and here was the opportunity. Really late in the game, I said, we really need these Republic Commandos. There is no lengthy documentary on the Mortis trilogy. Christian Taylor, who wrote the trilogy, and myself, we both firmly believe that we should really not answer directly a lot of the questions about Mortis. Was that really Qui-Gon Jinn that appeared to Obi-Wan in the cave or not? What does it mean that Ahsoka talks to her older self? Will she ever reach that age? Who was the father? What does it mean now that Anakin's the chosen one and that he has a better understanding of that? Ahsoka apparently died and she came back to life. Does that have any meaning? We have answers to those questions, for sure. But if I answer directly what something is, I feel that I'll be robbing you of the purpose of that arc, which is to make you wonder. It's to make you challenge certain ideas, to ask questions. There are many mysteries in Star Wars. There are many mysteries on the planet Mortis. I think George really started to delve back into the mythology that he created about the Force itself. And we started to see some of those elements be personified in the father, the son, and the daughter. George is highly involved in all aspects of this series, but when we deal directly with the Force, Christian Taylor and I feel very strongly that that word has to come directly from George. A lot of the notes from Mortis come from a really old binder that George has that has his original writings on what the Force is and what makes it up.
The core of the Force. I mean, you got the dark side, the light side. One is selfless, one is selfish. And you want to keep them in balance.
Slowly, over time, things will start to become more clear about Mortis. We aren't done exploring the nature of the Force and the kind of bigger mythical questions that we began to ask in the Mortis trilogy. Always in motion is the future, and the Clone Wars future is in motion right now, working on future episodes that will continue this rather intriguing arc that George has brought to light after many years. The story that George laid out for us was something that I think that we'd all, as Star Wars fans, as lovers of mythology, wanted to delve into for a very long time, which was a much more intensive look at the Force and Force wielders and how that's used, and this whole prophecy of the chosen one, and what does that mean? I was actually out of the room for the first, I think, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of George's pitch of these Force wielders, and I remember coming back in the room, and the writers were all just kind of wrapped up, like looking at George, and they saw me come in the room, and they looked at me, and they're like, "You got to hear this." And George sat me down, and he started explaining to you that these gods, and they wield the Force, they're much more powerful than any Jedi Knights. And this one turns into a gargoyle, and this one can turn into a griffin. He's just saying all this stuff. On your feet! I was like, wow, this is pretty intense. So, in the end, Christian Taylor, who wrote it, had a tremendous task on his hands to try and figure out, how do I take all these things that George just explained and that we've outlined together. And how is he going to put a voice to that? And to his credit, he did an amazing job. And Christian Taylor, the writer, and I were discussing these stories after George had laid them out, and we were discussing how do we conquer this and how do we bring it all together to make it make sense and still maintain some kind of continuity with the other Star Wars films. With something this supernatural, I would just tell Christian, you have to think of it like these are 3 entire episodes that take place in the tree when Luke is on Dagobah. This is all spiritual, this is all metaphor, this is all symbolic in some way. If we branch out our discussion from the dagger as a metaphor, then I can tell you the many things in this arc of stories is a metaphor. Everything is symbolic of everything that takes place in all 6 Star Wars films. One of the very interesting things in the final episode of Mortis that I know fans would have found very interesting was that George was looking for 2 ancient Sith Lords that could bring some meaning that would be kind of like an uber evil influence guiding the Son. And this was Darth Bane and Darth Revan, both of who existed in the EU. So it was going to be a big deal to bring these kind of legendary Sith Lords into Clone Wars, and thus, into the world of the George Lucas Star Wars story. We designed them. They are in the Clone Wars style. We modeled them in the Clone Wars style. And we shot the scene in the episode. The scene exists, but it never made it into animation. It only existed in layout. I was very apprehensive of this scene, as cool as it was, because of the implication of it, which is that these Sith Lords could separate themselves from the Force and somehow talk to the Son. That seems like a big deal. About the time after we had shot it and we sent the reel to George, George watches it, and he loved it. It was great. But eventually I got a call from George, and he said, I've been really thinking about this, and we should take that scene out with the Sith Lords. And as disappointing as it was in a way, I guess, because it would have been cool to have those characters appear in Clone Wars, it was absolutely the right thing to do, because they just can't exist in that form. They can't exist in that way. But I think for fans it would be neat to know that at least that idea was considered, that we went very far with it, and that in the end, after discussions, it was really George that said, no, this, I thought this would be good, but I wanted to do this, but it doesn't jive with my bigger explanation of the Force. And it gives you an insight to the detail to which he gets into these issues with the Force and these concepts of the bigger spiritual aspect of Star Wars. He's very involved in them, and to be honest, the writers and I feel very strongly when we're bringing these type of episodes to screen that, George has to be more involved than normal, because we have to get this stuff right. Of everything we do, we have to get this stuff right, because this is the Force. This is the whole ball game. Well, when we had the season 3 story meeting and we were working with George on coming up with how are these guys going to get through the Citadel, I remembered that Henry and I talked about this thing a long time ago. And I was like, well, what if they froze themselves and used carbon freezing to get through? Now we get to another dilemma, which is, so a lot of fans somehow, for some reason, hold the concept that when Han gets frozen in carbonite, that this is somehow the first time this was done. So I'm not sure where that comes from, because Vader somehow knows the facility is crude on Cloud City, but it should be, able to freeze Skywalker.
Reset the chamber for Skywalker.
So somehow he knows this process is going to work, almost like he's done it before. So that was enough really loose logic to run on that it would probably be Anakin's idea. Gillian Plunkett and I kept talking about, well, how do the Wookiees get to this moon? What do they travel in? It felt very strange that the Wookiees would have these kind of deep space travel vehicles. I know that they built a kind of pod that Yoda travels in Revenge of the Sith, but nothing quite fit, that they would have anything the size of like a Rebel blockade runner or even a shuttle. It seemed to be against their culture to have something that progressive, that they were traveling off-world all the time. It makes more sense that the Wookiees would hire someone. So George came up with the idea that Wookiees have these people that they're friendly with and they can get around from place to place. Matt Mekowitz, the writer, we both felt very strongly that the Trandoshans were the perfect enemy for this series because they, historically in the EU, are said to hunt down Wookiees and slave trade Wookiees. And when I set out to do this episode, I made sure that I had the time for a proper ending. This is a big moment. Ahsoka has been on her own. Anakin has been forced to let go. This scene where they reunite is important and it cannot be short.
Ahsoka!
This is the moment for Ahsoka. This is the moment where she says, "It's because of you and your training that I survived, Master. Even though you weren't there, you're a part of me. You can let go of that attachment."
And because of you, I did survive.
These are ideas that Anakin struggles with.
Stay with me.
His mother, Padme, Obi-Wan. People that he cares about, even R2. Yoda, in the Clone Wars movie, is trying to teach Anakin, through giving him a Padawan, to let go of his attachments. And Yoda knows there will come a point in time where Anakin will have to let go of that attachment, where he'll be faced with a situation where Ahsoka will be on her own, as Anakin's mother was on her own. And that there won't be anything Anakin can do to stop what's going to happen to Ahsoka or not. This is that moment. It's taken 3 seasons, but this episode arc is that moment where Anakin comes face to face with his worst fear, Ahsoka, in a situation there's nothing he can do.
Ahsoka, I am so sorry.
And this is her moment to say thank you. This is completely different than where she started in the movie. And she respectfully bows. I mean, when have you ever seen Anakin and Ahsoka really respectfully bow to each other? They walk off the landing platform with a different relationship than they had before. Anakin is much more settled. And you see Yoda, and he just silently watches this. And in a rare moment, we see Yoda smile because he feels that things, for once, are moving as he would have hoped. And that there is a possibility that this story will be written in a way that Yoda hopes happens. Now, unfortunately, we know that's not the case. And we know that Anakin, in the end, does turn to the dark side and become Darth Vader. It's going to be exciting to the finish. I can guarantee that.